Good morning. My name is Bob Armstrong. I'm director of the MIT Energy Initiative, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this morning for a special seminar with Secretary Katie Theoharides, Secretary of the Commonwealth's of Energy and Environment in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Secretary Theoharides joined the Baker-Polito Administration as Director of Climate and Global Warming Solutions in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs back in 2016. Prior to her appointment as secretary, she served as the administration's Undersecretary of Climate Change. As Undersecretary, she led the state's Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan and created the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which has worked with community support projects across the Commonwealth, awarding some $44 million since 2017 in those programs. She became secretary in May of 2019, and since then she has been really taking on work at breathtaking speed, spearheading initiatives to move the administration's climate, clean energy, and environmental agenda, including establishing a nation-leading target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This morning, she's going to talk to us about the work that she's doing with the administration along those lines in building a clean energy future for Massachusetts. So let me turn it over to Secretary Theoharides, and thank you very much for doing this program this morning.
Well, thank you, Bob, Professor Armstrong, for the terrific introduction and for the invitation to be with this group today. It is a real pleasure to join a group of people who are passionate about finding smart, science-based solutions to reducing emissions and ensuring a reliable supply of clean energy, and to have the opportunity to talk about some of the initiatives we're working on right here in our home state. I think it's an exciting time for us in Massachusetts as we continue to make significant progress on goals we've been working on now for the last 6 years or so to really decarbonize our future, build a more resilient Commonwealth, and invest in this clean energy transition. At the same time, it is just a thrilling time to be working on these issues because of the return of federal policy on climate change and the sense that all of this work is going to be greatly accelerated with good federal partners in the lead now. So I wanted to start today with a look at our net zero future, which is where Massachusetts is now headed, to set us on this course to best avoid the worst impacts of climate change and to align our climate change goals with where the science said we needed to go back in January of 2020, before the pandemic. And what seems like a lifetime ago, the governor set this aggressive target for Massachusetts to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And as a result of that, we were already in the process of a deep decarbonization pathways study to figure out how to get to 80%, which was our original goal under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so we updated that study, took out our pencils, and started pushing the analysis further to look at least an 85% reduction in emissions, and then sequestration of the remaining amount in our natural and working landscapes. And so that's what you see represented here in the green hatch marks, is some of that sequestration. And depending on the costs of mitigation and the costs of sequestration, as we move down this pathway, we could decide to reduce emissions, all the way down to 95% and sequester less, or we could decide to sequester as much as 15%. But just a few weeks ago, the governor strengthened this commitment to achieving net zero by 2050 when he signed comprehensive climate legislation that I'll talk about a little bit further that gives Massachusetts the most ambitious emissions reduction goals in the country, although now it's aligned with the 50% reduction that the Biden administration has set, except that we have a 1990 baseline and the feds have a 2005 baseline. So ours is a little bit more ambitious, but who's counting? Next slide, please. So our administration and the legislature have had a longstanding bipartisan record of partnership, particularly around energy and climate issues, and that has helped us to make some of the progress we've made in Massachusetts in our efforts to take on this generational challenge. And I think it really is a model for how folks at the federal level could go about passing important climate change and environmental laws. And so, you know, one of the things I've spent a lot of time on in this role and in my prior role during the last federal administration was trying to highlight bipartisanship and consensus around the need for climate change solutions, about not only the environmental benefits they create and the science behind climate change that's really not political, but about the opportunity to build strong economies, to create a clean energy workforce, and to really be leaders among other nations on these issues. But thanks to that partnership here in Massachusetts, we've once again added to our record of national leadership on climate change and taken a significant step to reduce emissions, to really turn up the action on climate change in what is really this next critical decade, while protecting vulnerable communities and achieving this longer term goal. So setting ourselves up and setting the table for hitting that longer term goal is a key part of the planning work we're doing now and of this act, creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. So what does this legislation do? There are a number of really critical pieces in it, some of which we have been working on very hard from the executive branch level already. First and foremost, it codifies into law that net zero target, so that it now has the force of law. It increases our authorization to solicit another 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind, which is a really important resource I'll talk more about today. And it will make our appliances more energy efficient and allow municipalities to opt into a highly efficient energy stretch code for newly constructed buildings. The building sector is a key part of hitting our emission reduction targets and something where we need a lot of additional work to hit our ambitions. It also includes really important nation-leading provisions that will help us protect our environmental justice communities as we make this transition to clean energy. And something that underpins much of our thinking on this at the state level is, all right, we're going to transition to a clean energy, decarbonized economy. We have to do that in a way that is inclusive and that includes people better in making those decisions than our current energy system did as it's been built. And so for the first time, these laws would require our Department of Environmental Protection to develop regulations to assess what's called the cumulative impact as part of permitting processes. Historically, how our agencies have looked at this and how agencies around the country have looked at permitting is not in terms of the full range of pollution a community deals with, but just in terms of the new pollution from a specific project. And this would change it in a way that would be sort of another first in the nation thing, but a real benefit to communities that have been overburdened by historic levels of environmental pollution. So our 2050 roadmap set the table for much of the work that we will be doing in the next 10 years to get us on this track to hit that target in 30 years. And the bill strengthens the commitment to achieving net zero in 2050. But this target, as I said, has been a real focus for us. And so developing the plan to understand the different pathways to get there is an important part of the implementation of our policies ahead. We know that this kind of goal requires urgent leadership. And we know that the cost of inaction will be devastating to our economy, to our health, and to our environment. And so that's been one of the driving forces behind this pathways study. The report that's pictured here is available. It is completed. It's a culmination of 2 years of science-based analysis using models and analytical tools to explore in great detail what steps the Commonwealth and the region need to take to achieve this goal while maintaining a healthy, thriving, and equitable economy. And this long-range analysis is really what have informed our effort, our plan, our 10-year plan over the next decade to achieve that 50% limit by 2030. Next slide, please. So after analyzing these 8 different pathways in the decarbonization report, we are confident that we can achieve this goal if we're smart about our approach and the strategies we select in terms of making it affordable, maintaining the economy we have here in the Commonwealth, and ensuring that this transition is not harder for our most vulnerable residents. Our analysis found that in many of the pathways we examined, that we can actually achieve net zero emissions in 2050 for about the same cost year on year as we would expect to spend already under the 80% model, and that this actually avoids additional impacts that we're not even costing into the study at this point. Next slide, please. So some of the key findings from this study, many of them were not unexpected to us and aligned with some of the policy choices and decisions we have been making, but we did learn some really key pieces. So one of the things that was clear is that our clean energy portfolio is really anchored by the significant offshore wind resource we have right off the coast of our Commonwealth. Really high capacity factor, great opportunity for coincidence with our winter peak, and also a great opportunity for economic development and creating this new clean energy workforce right here in Massachusetts. With that wind, though, and with all of the clean energy needs we have, the report showed that we really need significant interstate transmission to allow us not just to interconnect that wind, but to access a diversity of renewable generation in other states and in Canada, including hydro, including onshore wind in places like Maine, including large-scale solar. There's a number of things we need to do with interstate transmission. And plugging in 2 of our other sectors to this clean energy resource is obviously another important piece of that. So looking at significant electrification in the transportation and building heat sectors. And then a key principle of all of this is making sure that we're reducing costs by looking at life cycle turnover. So replacing things when they are due for replacement and not replacing something with something that's, for example, energy inefficient or a non-electric vehicle when 2 years down the road, you're just going to need to change it out. So the long-range study, as I mentioned, informed our clean energy and climate plan, which is a decadal plan we're required to complete under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so to put us in the best position to achieve net zero, we used that report to inform this plan. And as you can see here, there are a significant number of things we need to do across sectors to make progress to hit this really ambitious 50% goal. And I should note that right now, these numbers are actually set to a slightly lower target. So a 45% limit, we're going to bump them up across sectors to hit that 50% limit. And that's something we are updating our clean energy and climate plan for right now. So these numbers are actually a bit low, and yet you'll see they're still really ambitious. So in the heating sector, we need to retrofit about 1 million homes. We need to make sure that all of the new homes we're building are highly efficient new construction and help people adopt clean heating solutions, including air source heat pumps. in the transportation sector, we need to put about 750,000 new EVs on the road, and also achieve a reduction in vehicle miles traveled of about 15%. To give you a sense of that from the EV side of things, the Commonwealth as a state sells about 350,000 vehicles a year. So a significant number each year as we move towards 2030 has to be EVs going forward. We also need to build and interconnect 6,000 megawatts of clean energy and modernize our electric grid to support the development of these clean energy resources, which is no small challenge in and of itself. And as we've seen with our first offshore wind project, as well as our large-scale hydro project, some of this is within the state's control, and some of the timing and the delivery of those clean electrons is outside of our control. So a lot hinges on the work we do with our federal partners, with other states, in terms of making sure we can connect those new resources to the grid. So the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan outlines this blueprint for achieving these goals equitably and affordably, with major new initiatives to advance the decarbonization of the Commonwealth's buildings, transportation, and electricity sectors. This is really our map of how to make these changes over the next decade. And while the framework for this plan is strong, we are now focused on updating it to reflect the bill that the governor signed a few weeks ago, and to include significant additional stakeholder processes in those updates. So we're developing a plan and a timeline, and we'll be happy to be in touch to include feedback from this group and others as we revise that plan. I wanted to spend a moment or two talking about offshore wind and the procurements we've done on that front, as these recent months have really been a momentous time for clean energy and for offshore wind here in Massachusetts, and I think across the Eastern Seaboard. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management at the federal level has finalized the environmental impact statement for Vineyard Wind, which is an 800 megawatt offshore wind project. And this is a key long-awaited milestone. It was supposed to happen in my first couple of months on the job as secretary in June of 2019. It was close to being final, and then it got pulled back in the federal permitting process as more projects came on. There's now about 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in the pipeline, and the idea was, all right, this might be something that requires cumulative impacts analysis. And so we have spent the last 2 years working with the developer Vineyard Wind to ensure that the project can still move forward. And so getting this final environmental impact statement out and hearing that we should have very good news on the record of decision, hopefully by next week, has given us a lot of momentum, a lot of hope for the future that these projects will move forward and start delivering the clean energy resource, the jobs, and the environmental benefits. On March 11th, we also have extended that momentum. Our Department of Energy Resources filed a request for proposals for our third round of what's called our 83C offshore wind energy solicitation. And they file that with the Department of Public Utilities for review and approval. Once it's approved, it will come out for bids. And there are some key changes that we've made in the solicitation that I think are worth highlighting. One of the things that's been important to us is really learning from each of the solicitations. One of the first learnings that we had was to bake in a little bit more time for the federal permitting and review process. And we saw when folks came in for our second RFP that they considered that as well. But in this RFP, we're proposing to allow bids from 200 megawatts up all the way to 1,600 megawatts, which would be a doubling of any of the procurements we've had to date. And that is consistent with the Department of Energy Resources recommendation last year following its investigation into offshore wind transmission. The allowance for larger sized bids is really intended to capture potential efficiencies related to transmission cabling, as well as the use of onshore transmission interconnection points. But we don't have a preferred size, so we'll take bids of any size up to 1,600 megawatts. And the RFP is really a result of extensive stakeholder engagement, which led to some important changes that will allow us to build on the Commonwealth's commitment to environmental justice, to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce. And so for the first time, the RFP will require bidders to submit diversity, equity, and inclusion plans that include a workforce diversity plan and supplier diversity program plan, and to track and report on the status of environmental justice impacts, engagement, and employment, including training, recruitment, and hiring opportunities. And so we're building this workforce from the ground up. Can we do it in a more equitable and inclusive way? The RFP also includes an environmental and socioeconomic impact evaluation, which asks bidders to detail any potential impacts, both positive and negative, including assessments of cumulative environmental impacts on environmental justice populations and host communities. So really excited about these changes and think it moves the entire industry in the right direction. Another piece we're working on as a direct result of our 2030 planning is wholesale market reform. And so to meet our climate goals, it's essential that we modernize our electric grid to support the development of clean energy in the Commonwealth and across New England. We work in a six state system operator region, ISO New England, and beginning in the fall of last year, our New England states began convening to discuss how to address the needs for reforms to the regional electricity market, which really doesn't currently reflect the policy goals around climate change that most of the states have. And so these discussions culminated in the release of a vision statement back in October, and then led to a series of technical conferences held in the winter around the four major areas, including the governance of ISO, wholesale electricity markets, transmission planning, and environmental justice. And we have heard from experts and states around the region and around the country and even the world. But one of the key points is that the ISO governance structure needs to accommodate greater transparency. We need additional input from state leaderships in that governance. We need to address the lack of alignment with state policy that I mentioned in current resource adequacy mechanism, and the region should move toward a technology neutral forward clean energy market model. And so that's something we are looking at designing with the other states. And then I think a key part of this, and something that we've recognized throughout our work on this, is that the region needs to engage in scenario-based, forward-looking long-term transmission planning to understand how to meet the energy needs of the future, and that siting decisions really need to accommodate greater proactive participation from environmental justice communities, so that we're building this new energy system in a way that is inclusive and that avoids conflict. The need for regional reform is really clear, particularly considering recent work, such as our decarbonization roadmap. And the roadmap shows that under all of the scenarios examined, New England needs about 1,000 to 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind coming onto our grid starting in 2030 every year. And with that, 500 to 1,000 megawatts of solar every year. Significant new transmission upgrades come with that. And I think we are optimistic about the process so far, but it's something we absolutely have to get right to achieve these goals. Next slide, please. So we are also working, as I mentioned, on reducing emissions from the heating sector. That's critical to achieving these goals. And while some parts of our plan may change during the coming months as we update our clean energy and climate plan to align with the legislation signed by the governor, this is one of the initiatives we're moving forward, which is a commission on clean heat. And the commission is going to provide the governor recommendations on setting a cap for the heating fuel sector, and then achieving that cap through the development of policies to support the transition to cleaner heating cleaner heating options. So we're working on getting the right stakeholders engaged with that commission right now, and ensuring we have technical experts who can help us work out some of these challenging areas to reduce emissions in the heating sector. Next slide, please. We also, at the same time, are conducting a future of natural gas investigation at the Department of Public Utilities, and that was opened back in October of 2020 to look at the role of local natural gas distribution companies in the future of the Commonwealth's energy portfolio, given that we have this net zero goal. And the order requires gas companies operating in the state to hire an independent consultant to examine various pathways that the companies can help to achieve this net zero future. And this work is really going to both build on the work we're doing and also inform the work of the commission. So looking forward to the outcomes from this study. Next slide. We are also working at this very moment on our 3-year energy efficiency plans at our Department of Energy Resources. And these are key to helping ensure that our building stock is as efficient as it can be moving forward. We are usually 1 or 2 this last year in the nation in terms of our Mass Save program and what it means from an energy efficiency sort of leadership position. But as we enter this coming decade, we're focused on ensuring that we are getting our building stock as energy efficient as it can be, moving from, you know, light bulbs and sort of easier things to deep energy retrofits and insulation, which is currently free. If anyone is looking to insulate their home, it's 100% coverage from our Mass Save program. But currently, you know, some of the key issue areas here are expanding electrification, weatherization, and deeper energy efficiency measures, as I mentioned, looking at a phase out of fossil fuel heating incentives, and also really working to improve program equity and to reach low and moderate income customers, to reach renters, customers who don't speak English, small businesses, and environmental justice communities. So some of our priorities going forward. Energy storage has been a big piece of our work in this space. And since the governor took office in 2015, we've made significant progress on energy storage. The opportunity really became clear a number of years ago when winter energy price volatility hit us in a big way during the polar vortex, I think back in transition from 2017 to 2018. And also in 2014 to 2015. And in 2015, we launched this energy storage initiative and funded our state of charge study to show that energy storage is a game changer. And we've committed about $20 million in energy storage grants and began incorporating energy storage into widely accessible policy programs as a result of that initial investment across the state. And so one of the, I think we were in fact the first in the nation to include energy storage incentives directly in our solar program. So that's been a key place for it. And since launching that program in 2017, we currently have nearly 1,600 megawatt hours of approved and qualified energy storage through that program, exceeding our initial target for 2025 of 1,000 megawatt hours. And we also have a energy storage incentive in our energy efficiency programs, and last year launched our Clean Peak Energy Standard program, which is a financial incentive program promoting the use of clean energy to supply power when electricity demand is at its highest, so during peak use. A lot of exciting work in this space. A lot of work is going on at MIT in this space as well. So among exciting areas for partnership. This is certainly one of them. Next slide, please. The final piece I wanted to mention, and then I'd love to open it up for questions, is our Transportation and Climate Initiative program. It is a cap and invest program we have been working on regionally for the last 5 years or so. And even before that, Massachusetts was involved in discussions on this program. It is based on sort of the ideas and the learning we had from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, another regional cap and trade program. And back in December of this year, we signed a memorandum of understanding with Rhode Island, Connecticut, and the District of Columbia to move this program forward. And very, very excited. What the program does is it caps pollution from the transportation sector. It will drive down pollution in this sector 26% by 2030, significantly contributing to our goals as a state in terms of emissions. And it will also generate $1.8 billion of revenue to invest in a clean, equitable transportation system here in Massachusetts. So that's just the dollars for Massachusetts. We've been working on this with 9 other states. We expect many more of them to come into the program, but just a critical opportunity to both reduce emissions in this sector, deliver cleaner energy and cleaner air, and then to reinvest the proceeds in paving the way for the new future of transportation. And I shouldn't use the term paving, but it's easy to use because the solutions here are not just about zero emission vehicles and cars and trucks. They're also about public transit. They're also about walkability and safety in our communities, and about ensuring that as we go forward from this pandemic, there are investments in our infrastructure across the state, including infrastructure like wireless in rural communities. So a great program moving forward. We are doing a reporting only year with auctions of the credits in 2022, and then moving to full compliance in 2023 as we work to get other states on board to join the program and expand the impact in terms of emissions from beyond our southern New England region. So with that, I will end. I am really excited about working with this community and finding ways to partner with Mighty, with others at MIT. We have this great richness of resources here in the Commonwealth in terms of our educational institutions. And I think through an initial conversation we had with Professor Armstrong and the team here, we've seen tremendous areas of overlap. So excited for questions today, but really excited for partnerships ahead as we all have to work towards this major decarbonization goal we have as a state and now as a nation.
Great. Thank you so much, Secretary Theoharides. That was a really interesting overview of as advertised, a very ambitious plan and very broad plan. So that was great. It as you might imagine, it's engendered a lot of questions. People have some of these you've touched on in bits and pieces through your presentation, but maybe we could do a little bit deeper dive into some of these. So one question came up right away as you were talking is looked in at the transportation area, and I suppose that's because in Massachusetts that's the largest emitting sector, and among questions there are what about public transportation? You just touched on that a bit, but more generally, how about car independent transportation, which you also touched a bit on, right? So how might we reduce emissions by moving away from cars in addition to low emissions vehicles like electric vehicles?
No, it's a great question, and I think we know that in places where in communities where people don't have other options besides vehicles, we absolutely have to transition them to zero emission vehicles. But there are lots of opportunities to invest in our transportation, our public transportation systems, increase public transportation access, make cleaner public transit solutions available, particularly in our bus fleets, which have high usage, and also high usage in environmental justice pollution communities where pollution is a major issue. And so that's something we're looking at in the very near term with TCI proceeds, is how to get as many electric buses and the infrastructure that's required for those buses, which is no small feat, sort of the bus yards that are connected to the grid and have all of the things they need, and the investments that we need to make to get those bus yards ramped up. So that's one key piece. I mean, I think another key piece of this all is ensuring that as we return from the pandemic, people are returning to public transit and not abandoning it for their cars. That's something I worry about quite a bit. And so ensuring access to continued fast, efficient service that people are using, looking at if people are using transit in different patterns than they were pre-pandemic, how are we making sure that we're serving those different patterns? You know, I think we're going to see a lot of people working in some kind of hybrid system, possibly commuting at slightly different hours, maybe coming in a little later, leaving a little earlier, maybe something different. But this is something we're working on actually administration-wide through a future of work initiative. And one of the pieces of that is, what is transportation going to look like? And how can we make sure that we're not losing people from our public transit system to vehicles? Another thing that we've seen that I think is a real opportunity for non-car transportation coming out of the pandemic is a real interest in walkable, bikeable communities with outdoor dining and sort of a more community feel in our downtowns. And I think while, reducing VMT through some of these walking, biking, planned growth strategies can be, it can take longer and it might be more expensive on a cost per carbon basis. The co-benefits of programs like these are huge in terms of creating better livable communities, air pollution, congestion, all the rest. So we are going to have a much broader focus on reducing VMTs through planning and last mile solutions and biking, other options in our new plan. So something we'll be talking about a lot more than in our current version. And then the final thing I'd say here is that we have a big focus right now on commercial fleets and medium and heavy duty electrification, and making sure that we're supporting not just incentives for the vehicles or charging stations, but also some of the infrastructure that companies and people and government entities need to get those fleets. We just rolled out a program with the Mass Clean Energy Center last week to actually put people within their organizations who are fleet managers and can help with purchasing, with setting up the infrastructure they need to run these fleets and sort of make the transition smoother, because a lot of times there's just sort of a gap between adoption of new technology, and that's a gap we're trying to close. Sorry, long answer.
No, that's great. You covered a lot of ground there. I have a personal interest in mass transit, since that's how I get to MIT.
Yeah.
When I go to MIT, and hope to go back after the pandemic subsides. So during the pandemic, early days of the pandemic, a lot of the routes, mass transit routes, were cut in service, or at least reduced in service. So is part of the plan then to bring those back soon, because otherwise people are not going to come back to mass transit? And
so many of them have already come back, and the ones that were reduced for a while, we're looking at, I believe, I should check this with my colleague at MassDOT, but I believe it's a June timeframe for routes to come back. And then, as I mentioned, it really will be that close watching of, what people are returning to and what additional or different services they might need. We might be seeing a commuter rail, for example, that is actually making more trips during the middle of the day. It used to be you could get in and out of the city at normal working hours, but it was really sparse in between. And I think we're just all waiting to see what it's going to look like moving forward.
Yeah. And also with transportation, obviously a big focus on electrification, as well as moving people out of cars and into mass transit or bicycles or walking. What about alternatives to electric vehicles, like hydrogen fuel vehicles? Maybe not for the light duty vehicle space, but for trucking or other longer distance applications. And how might that connect with our regional engagements? If trucking is going to move across state boundaries, you need to be able to fuel along whatever routes those look like. At last count, I think Massachusetts had 4 hydrogen fueling stations. Don't know what it is
I think it
now.
still might be, it might be 6
Yeah,
now, but
6. Okay, well, it's 50% more, right?
yeah.
Uh, but is that an area that the Commonwealth is looking at? And is there a particular aspect there, the trucking or?
So we think, we think for hydrogen that it's going to play a key role, particularly for freight, for medium, for large trucking, for ship freighting, for potentially for fleets at the airport and at the MBTA. Some of our larger sort of heavy duty vehicles, absolutely going to be something that we need, and I think something that we have potential to create here through excess capacity from some of our renewable resources, whether it's wind or what have you. So I think the opportunity is great. It is an area where we think this is something the state can't do on our own, just given sort of the set of investment hurdles and technology hurdles that need to be taken down, and sort of the adoption too. So we are excited that we've seen early signals from the feds that this is going to be something they are investing time and resources into, and I think also a great opportunity to partner with folks at MIT and in our other institutions of higher education on the innovation side, because I think there's a real opportunity here, and there may even be one in the light duty sector. But it's sort of like a Blu-ray DVD situation that the state can't afford to get into on our own. We can't, we don't want to choose, the wrong one and invest all of this infrastructure without a little bit more assistance from our federal partners. So I think that's a big opportunity. One of the other things we've done to try to get past some of the initial challenges to this is to make it, to work with the fire department actually in Boston to make it permissible for hydrogen vehicles to transit through tunnels and bridges, which little things like that are actually kind of a big deal. And so we've been working on some of those things. We are also now offering incentives through our More EV program, not just to electric vehicles, but also to hydrogen fuel cell vehicles if folks want to buy them.
Yeah. So on the hydrogen thing, but then broadening out, hydrogen, is there a look at hydrogen for reducing emissions in home and building heating? That's another area where electrification is clearly a big play there.
Yeah.
But a fuel like hydrogen or biogas or some other fuel might also be quite useful in achieving emissions goals for the heating of buildings.
Yes.
What's the Commonwealth's thinking in those areas?
Yeah. So I think this is something that our commission is definitely going to take up, sort of within the future of heating, how much of this is going to be driven by hydrogen and biogas. Are the limits, the sort of feedstock limits on the biogas front, going to be something that is a lasting thing? Are there ways, we haven't looked at this yet, in terms of sort of just the availability of that feedstock? But I do suspect, given the focus on hydrogen and renewable gas, not just here, but certainly in Europe and other places, that this will be probably a bigger part of our residential heating sector than we imagine right now. And I think it will certainly be a big part of our urban landscapes and sort of large building spaces, whether it's labs and biotech or factories and warehouses, other large facilities, large buildings in Boston. And again, I think here the question is, how much is going to be electrified and how much is going to be hydrogen? We don't have a crystal ball on that right now, but I think, it will be important for us to stay very well linked in with folks at the Department of Energy at the federal level who are working on this, and with our colleagues around the state at various institutions, just to figure out how much of a viable solution this is going to be, and then what are the appropriate scales to deploy it at. And I also think, I think the LDCs, the gas companies, the gas utilities have a vested interest in having some form of fuel running through their pipes. And so I imagine this will be a big part of their strategy going forward as well.
Yeah, so one of the questions from the audience on this topic is with electrification, given that right now natural gas prices are really low, how do you incentivize people to switch over to air source heat pumps for heating when there's this cheap alternative? Now, not everybody has natural gas. I mean, I think we're at 3/4 fossil fuel usage for supplying building heating needs in Massachusetts. And natural gas is part of that, but there's home heating oil, propane in that mix as well. So I'm curious about and someone asked in the Q&A, what do you do to incentivize the electrification where you can in buildings?
So we are absolutely looking at richer incentives to encourage more air source heat pump adoption, particularly through our 3-year energy efficiency plans. So those will include increased investments in electrification for both residential and commercial customers, also to increase the number of retrofits we do, because one of the key pieces to electrifying is getting homes really tight, and it's also a no regret strategy if we do end up with some other heating fuel, because you still want to use as little as possible. So one of the keys here is 100% coverage for insulation, and then some new enhanced incentives for electrification for moderate income customers and for landlords who have historically participated in some of these programs at lower rates. We are also looking at investments in terms of workforce training. There are states that are doing better than Massachusetts in terms of their workforce and heat pumps. Maine actually comes to mind as having a really great workforce, and I think part of that is because they have a lot of oil customers in Maine, and that switch out is a little bit clearer. But we have a new $12 million investment each year authorized under the recent climate bill, actually, for workforce training and market transformation, to invest directly in this building, in building the market and training contractors for ramping up electrofits and retrofits and electrification. And I think that's education, as much as the incentives play a role, education both of people who are making those decisions in their homes, because again, you want to change things out when the thing breaks, or when you're doing a home energy audit, but also education of our workforce and the Mass Save program providers, so that this is an option and they can really sort of deliver it to people and make people know about it is a key part of this. We're also doing things through the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, who's played a real role in the heat pump space. And so we're doing a home MVP program, which is a contractor-led retrofit program, as well as sort of a whole home retrofit program to give you new financing and rebate programs, including a launch of the commercial PACE financing for commercial building retrofits, and then an upcoming rebate program through our Department of Energy resources for residential ground source heat pumps that are paired with weatherization. So a lot more to come on that.
Okay.
it's an expense right now. It is more expensive, certainly.
Yeah,
So moving people to that will take some effort.
yeah. No, that's just great progress. A lot of good thinking. Um, Along that line, a way to sort of level the playing field there is a price on carbon.
Mhm.
And during the prior to reconciliation, the Senate version of the climate bill that Governor Baker signed not so long ago included a carbon tax, which would have been progressive. Can you share some of the barriers to implementing that tax or getting that in legislation? What are some of the challenges in Massachusetts for that?
Yeah, well, that's one, I don't know exactly what happened between the Senate and the House to get to their conference bill that came to the governor's desk. I do know that there is often a feeling that doing carbon taxes, doing cap and trade programs is best done at the regional or federal level, so that Massachusetts is not sort of creating a less competitive economic climate. And so that's why, that's why we do RGGI at the regional level. That's why we designed TCI to be regional. And, we feel confident going forward with Southern New England as a small region, because those are our borders where people might be buying gas. And so it gives us the confidence that we're not setting Massachusetts at a disadvantage. I will say, one of the things we're looking at through this Future of Clean Heat Commission is setting a cap for the heating sector, and it might be designed just like TCI or RGGI. And so then we would effectively have a price across most of the major carbon sectors. And so at that point, we would have some form of price instrument. I am very hopeful that the feds take this up. And of course, the issue will be to get something like a federal carbon price, they're going to need legislation. And that means they're going to need some bipartisan collaboration. But, I think clear federal standards and some policy flexibility for states as to how they meet them is a good way to go here. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see more market-based solutions, more pricing moving forward.
That's great. So a question, another question that came up in the building heating area is that as we look to more electrification there, well, actually this applies to other sectors too, more electrification in vehicle transportation, we sort of lose an intrinsic resilience of the system, in that we have a diversity of fuel types. And I'm interested in your thinking. One of the audience was interested in your thinking on how do you increase the resilience of our system or maintain resilience as we become more and more reliant on a single source of energy or carrier of energy, namely electricity.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I have the ultimate answer on this one, but we are very aware that significant electrification in the building and transportation sector places a real enhanced burden on our grid. And we've seen, Texas was a good reminder, but grid resiliency and just the new investments we have to make in our grid and moving towards a smarter grid with time of use charging and all of those things to balance the increased use on our electric system is going to be critical moving forward. I think there are a number of challenges with that, not just the investment that's needed, but also the siting of new grid infrastructure is, I think, a real challenge moving forward, not least because we have a limited land base. And so the number of new substations, for example, that we may need here in Massachusetts, I think will be a challenge with a currently very developed state. But I think this is something both at the transmission and distribution grid level that we're going to need to do detailed follow-on scenario planning for. If we're going to this scenario with this level of electrification and this level of renewable generation and distributed generation, what does the grid need to look like, and where is it going to go, and how are we going to get there, and what is the cost? So a lot more to come there, but it's something that it's keeping me up a little bit at night. It's something the governor actually thinks about quite a lot and has a lot of questions on. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for future work in this space.
So it just looks like from the roadmap that you showed and that the results of your study resonate with studies we've done here, that the last bit of decarbonization in any of these sectors, whether it's transportation or electricity generation or heating, that last bit of emissions removal gets very, very expensive. And so you show a little bit of residual there and then negative emissions, so you can get to the net zero targets. Can you say a little bit more about how you see that? What's the opportunity there for the negative emissions technologies and perhaps for carbon dioxide removal technologies more in towards 2050 and beyond, as we try to get our concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere down to the right levels?
Yeah, so you're right. As we get closer to that net zero number and the at least 85% emission reductions we have to hit as a state, it gets increasingly difficult, increasingly expensive. You run up against things like air traffic and large freight and some of the hardest buildings in the building sector to change. So we do think that carbon capture has great potential to help us meet our climate goals. In our decarbonization roadmap, we were very focused on sort of natural carbon capture, sequestration in our land base. We're 60% forested. We have great working lands that are using many techniques like cover crops and advanced tillage methods to store more carbon in the soil. I come from a landscape ecology background, so it's a passion of mine, is figuring out how can we do more carbon sequestration that benefits not only our climate mitigation goals, but also our resiliency goals. So, we are certainly focused on our land portfolio helping us achieve that, whether it's some of these new techniques for wetland restoration and blue carbon storage, or just making sure we're continuing to protect open space in many of our communities and sequester carbon permanently that way. I do think there is going to be a role for carbon capture and storage in terms of as a technology. And I think if the technology develops, it could play an important role in helping meet our climate goals, here in Massachusetts, but across the country, across the world. I think, our plan has been not to rely on that in any of our scenarios. So our scenarios are trying to figure out a way to get there. If CCS does not develop, I think it probably will. And so, I think it could be a huge piece of anyone's decarbonization strategy if it does. But in the meantime, we're very focused on sort of nature-based carbon sequestration and making sure that happens, because you have to set that up well in advance. You can't just build a forest and hope it sucks in some carbon in 2049 to hit your goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to be conscious of your time. I know we're getting at the end of the time we had allowed. I have one last question I'd like to ask if you're up for that. I'm inundated with questions here. So, but here's one I think would be an interesting one to close on, which is this questioner wants to give you a magic wand that you could wave. So to imagine some new technology or idea that could solve a major challenge you're facing across the state. What might that technology be? What would it do?
I think if you could flow electrons without wires and substations, that would be pretty good. So every house just has a receiver and pulls in the electricity from the sky. That one sounds a little far-fetched, so maybe I can come up with a better example. But to me, non-wire alternatives and bringing them to a price point that really works in our energy grid is something that occurs to me as something that could be really game-changing. I think this is not a new technology, but if we could snap our fingers and make the housing stock we have in Massachusetts all super energy efficient and not so costly to change, that would be another big game changer for the emissions side.
Yeah.
And then the last one I'd say is long-term storage batteries. So something that can really shift peak, not just for several hours, but over months. So storage systems that are longer term.
Yeah.
So some, just a few small challenges there.
Yeah. No, wireless transmission, which we've done. So we have examples, but not on the scale you're talking.
Yeah. Large scale wireless. Yeah.
And there have been people at MIT who've worked on basically paper thin insulation. So wallpaper your rooms, right? And then they're highly insulated. That needs more work, but the ideas have been worked on. So those are good.
So there's more to talk about.
Oh yeah, no. Yeah. That's your chance to put out your wish list and get this community.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna write a longer one, but
okay.
Sounds like lots of good opportunities for much more discussion.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's really inspiring to see, our state working so aggressively to address I think the world's big challenge right now is how do we get the climate problem solved so that we have a livable future for us and for our children and their children going forward. And how we can do that in a way that's exportable, right? So that others can take advantage and learn from what we do, as we learn from what they do. So thanks so much for doing this. Great to see your leadership here, and I hope we can stay in touch with you and your team as you go forward on this net zero journey.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Secretary Theoharides.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay.
All right.
Goodbye.
Take care.